Today we will continue to discuss the interconnections between the sufficiently general theory of governance and life. In general, our educational standards for higher education are built in such a way that the overwhelming majority are governarily illiterate. This is expressed not only in the fact that in each specialty, if the themes of governance are touched upon, then some narrow applied version of theory of governance is given. This is expressed in the fact that practically everything related to the optimization of processes of governance, and these are those taken decisions, is left out of teaching courses. There is such a course, Operations Research, in which, in general, all the mathematics which can be applied to the optimization of various kinds of solutions, including governorial tasks, as well as design engineering tasks, is collected. First question, what is optimization? It is sometimes said that this is the most optimal solution. Such a phrase is meaningless because the word optimal already implies that this is the best solution, and it is the only one. Or it is a certain plurality of solutions that are formally indistinguishable by some criteria. Since you anyhow need to have exits from the abstractionism of theory of governance to life, we will touch only on one of the methods for the optimization of various kinds of solutions, the method of dynamic programming. The name has been translated from English. In my opinion, this is not the best translation, but nevertheless the name is well established. Why are we going to touch only on it? Well, mainly because the method of dynamic programming is practically omnivorous in relation to the solution of tasks. There are other methods that have a narrow specialization, but the correlation between them is such that if narrowly specialized methods do not enable you to solve a task, then the method of dynamic programming, in the majority of cases, allows you to solve it. Moreover, those pictures that accompany the method of dynamic programming, they turn out to be objectively linked in our psyche, associatively, with everything that concerns the matrices of the possible state of matter, the paths of transition from some states to others. But the tasks of optimizing solutions they arise very often, and we can't always evaluate which solution is preferable simply by our intellectual efforts directly. Because if, say, an object is described by several hundred parameters, and several variants or a plurality of variants of the process of governance are possible, then to choose the best one, this requires the construction of a certain model of the process and the search for some optimum from the whole plurality of governances. The method of dynamic programming is functionally operable under the assumption that the task can be interpreted as an n-step process. In addition, each subsequent position of the object is described by a function, the arguments of which are the previous positions of the object and the governance selected in the previous position of the object. It is called step governance. In addition, each position of the object is characterized by a certain gain, which is called a step gain. The step gain depends, again, on the position of the object and on the governance at each step. The total gain is the sum of all step gains. This is the criterion of optimality. Because under the assumptions of the method of dynamic programming, the maximum or minimum of the criterion of this total gain, it allows you to choose a certain process that is optimal from the point of view of the model, or a certain plurality of processes. The extreme value of the total gain for which they are the same, and in this sense formally indistinguishable, identical. In addition, there are some other restrictions. The structure of the task should not change when the calculated number of steps n changes, and the dimensionality of the space that describes the state of the system should also not change, depending on the number of steps n. There is one more restriction. The choice of governance at each stage must not deny the choice of governance in subsequent stages. In other words, the choice in any state should be determined by the state itself, and not by the prehistory of how the object ended up in this state. This limitation in principle can be circumvented formally, assuming that each of the previous variants is a component of the vector of state. Then the dimensionality of the task increases, and each variant, with its own prehistory, becomes its own separate variant. Well, furthermore, the function that determines the step gain, that is, the step criterion for evaluating the quality of governance, it can be different for each step. And, in addition, in some cases, the total gain can be represented not as a sum, but as a product. But then the requirement is such that the sign of this product does not change throughout the entire process. That is, all partial step gains must be positive. Such are the initial prerequisites for building the method of dynamic programming. Now, the method itself. What is shown in the first picture? Initial position of the object, two intermediate positions, and a final position. Each position is characterized by a certain evaluation, and each transition is also characterized by a certain evaluation. But if we set the task of maximizing the total gain, then, accordingly, somewhere among the entire set of trajectories, we must find one on which this total gain reaches its maximum value. In principle, the sum does not change from a change in the places of the terms. But practice shows that the process is easier to perceive when everything starts from the final position and the prehistory of getting into it. Let's consider the final position. Its gain is 7. Here 10, 3, 6. And the prehistory of the question. Suppose that we have already, in a certain way, passed through all this, and the system is in one of these positions. What then remains for us to do in order to determine the step gain? Perform simple arithmetic operations. Add the estimate of the transition trajectory to the final one. Where will the maximum be? 10 plus 7 is the maximum. If 10 plus 7 is the maximum, then, accordingly, we are already able to consider again this here plurality, but to consider it already in the quality of final plurality, and repeat the same procedure for the previous plurality. When we evaluate in this way, and remember all possible states, all transitions from one state to another, then, among the plurality of total gains, we will get a certain one that will reach a maximum. Or in some cases, it may turn out that this maximum is reached at several trajectories. This is the essence of the very formalistics of the method of dynamic programming. Now let's look at how this formalistics is connected with life. In order to look at this, we will already have to move from this figure to this one. It depicts 5 pluralities of states of an object. Each plurality has possible positions that an object can occupy. However, in contrast to this figure, each plurality is ordered according to the measure of the quality of governance. That is, the higher the quality of governance, and the evaluation of the error of governance is less. The larger the error of governance, the lower the evaluation of the quality of governance. The first question is, what stands behind the error? Behind the error, in this form, there stands a vector of error of governance, the dimensionality of which is generally unknown to us. But in practical tasks, complex tasks of social governance, there may be about several thousand parameters in some cases. And in order to present such a picture, all these parameters should be combined into one error, which characterizes the quality of governance. Further, There are two initial positions, or two subjects, that find themselves in such situations. Task, by the time it enters the fifth plurality, to reduce the error of governance to 0, and thereby reach the optimum. And what stands behind all these here pluralities and paths of transition from one state to another in life? The reality is such that behind all this here, there stands an objective matrix, a component of the triunity of matter, information, measure, which determines all possible states of the object of governance, all possible paths of transition from one state to another. That is, you see, the matrix is objective. It exists regardless of whether we know about it, we don't know about it, whether we want to solve a governorial task or not. It exists. Well, further, the question arises, in order to govern, what do we need? The reality is such that in order to govern, we need to adequately identify the initial state. And we must have a vision of at least one path that allows us to come from the initial state to the final one. What can be said about the final state? Indeed, if we consider a certain plurality of possible processes of governance, then each of these processes is a particular process of governance. If we complete it in the fifth plurality, then life does not stop there. And the reality is such that any of the final states is a fragment of some encompassing process. This is the encompassing process. But imagine that we are somewhere here, and the state 5-1 for us is very attractive. But in life, this state 5-1 boils down to the fact that the task is not to be late for the Titanic, which is about to set out on its maiden voyage. If we successfully reach the position 5-1, then we will have a lot of adventures that we may not get out of alive. What do we get? In general, we get the aphorism, "Do not start a doing, the end of which is not in your hands." That is, when starting a process of governance, you must be sure that the final state, in the case of its achievement, belongs to an encompassing process which, firstly, will exist by the time it is achieved, and secondly, in terms of its characteristics, it will be an acceptable for you process, which will not contradict any of your other objectives and desires that are outside of this very particular process of governance. Is this side of the question understandable? The reality connected with this question is such that the task of stability in terms of predictability of the behavior of an object is of a two-aspected character. The first aspect concerns the stability of the entire transition from the initial state to the desired one, and the second aspect is connected with the encompassing process into which you must enter in the final state of your particular process. Now, one more thing. Suppose that you actually find yourself here, and you think that you are here. What can this lead to? In the picture that is drawn, in general, from this and from this position, you can find yourself here. But such situations are possible when the error in determining the initial state is such that in the matrix there are no paths of transition from this state over here to here. What will happen? You will not be able to achieve the objective of governance, although you will get some result. Well, if you don't know what you want to end the process with, the situation is simple. Whoever does not know which harbor to sail to, for that one there is no favorable wind. And precisely thanks to the fact that the method of dynamic programming requires determinedness, in the initial state and in the final state, it is a kind of test that allows you to distinguish blabberology on governorial themes from the real setting of some governorial tasks and ways to optimize them. Why? Because if you do not have the ability to determine the initial and final states, then all this here hangs in the air, and there is complete non-determinism. If you read many books on economics, on some other problems of social governance, then you will come across the fact that in those cases, when it would seem desirable to raise the question of optimal governorial decisions, there begins either deviation or demagogy, which stems from the fact that the authors of the text do not have a very good idea of the initial position, do not have a very good idea of what they want to achieve in the future, and also do not have a very good idea of the paths of transition from one state to another. But, nevertheless, there are a number of life characteristics that must also be borne in mind. Initial conditions may vary, they may vary greatly. But if we consider just such a situation from the position of hierarchically higher governance, which encompasses these very governances, then the inorderliness of states, according to the measure of the error of governance, it is objective in relation to subjects A and B. If they are more or less adequate, then they also perceive this objective inorderliness. Accordingly, whatever the differences at the initial moment, for them a common objective arises. And further it turns out that the matrix is described by saying, with some additions, all roads lead to Rome. That is, the initial states can be whatever, but the objective is here. And if someone does not agree, then those roads that do not lead to Rome, they lead to problems or to non-being. This feature of the method of dynamic programming, what relation does it have to what was said in the previous lecture when I talked about supersystems and processes in them? After the division of the supersystem into autonomous regions has occurred, these autonomous regions can disperse anywhere and in any way. That is, the spread between them can be very, very large. But if the development is going correctly, then they all go here. And then, who is the leader of development? The one who sees this very perspective. And if he sees it, then providing information to here about this perspective and building paths in the matrix. How to build paths in the matrix to fill possibilities with some real material, informational algorithmic content. Then he objectively works for this here. The next point, if the task of stability in terms of predictability has been solved for a particular process and for an encompassing process on which it should go, what does this factually mean? Factually, this means that if the process is stable in this sense, then for you, as a governor, there is no fundamental difference between the future that you have outlined and the present, which is quite different from the future. With what is this connected in life? In general, from this circumstance stems the emotional self-sufficiency of the human type of psyche structure. Because the subject with the human type of psyche structure, he is somewhere on the path that leads to the optimum. The process is stable. He has no reason to be nervous, to worry, to be dissatisfied with something. Any transitions in the matrix require some resources. Well, resources, very often, are a measure for the evaluation of paths of transition. So where does this lead? This leads in general to the fact that the path in principle can be feasible, but if you squandered resources before you came to it, by this path along the matrix you may not pass. For example, if we assume that the area between the upper axis and the trajectory is an estimate of the quality of governance towards a particular process in this here system, then the smaller the area, the higher the quality of governance towards the process as a whole, the smaller the integral error of governance. Well, let's say that this path here, from B to 5,3, is very energy intensive. You do not have such power. What will happen? You will have to go to 5,3 along this path here. Suppose you pushed yourself and decided to come after all to this trajectory. You came to the second position, and then you were not able to maintain the process, and a breakdown of governance occurs, as a result of which you find yourself in either 3.1 or 3.2. The matrix is such that you can egress from 3.2, but you cannot egress from 3.1 to 5.3. What are the conclusions? There was no need to push yourself. It was necessary to quietly and calmly go to 3.2, and from 3.2 either through 4.3 or through 4.4 to 5.1. Remember the saying, he who does not take risks does not drink champagne. This is precisely about that. And who does not drink? He does not take risks and achieves the objectives. There is a fairy tale, Sleeping Beauty. What does it have to do with this?
Давайте.
A princess is born. A ball. Fairies come. What happens at the ball, can it be considered as a step-by-step process? It can. Magic can be defined as alternative physics. If we think, we emit something. If we speak, we also emit something. Certain physical fields. These physical fields, spreading in the material environment, impact it. Since our emission is formatted by certain algorithmics and information, our emission is not a sinusoid that lives in an electrical outlet. It is a rather complex melody. And if you sense objects in the environment and are able to produce something to which they will respond, then by word or by thought, you are able to have a direct impact on the course of the process in life. And what do the fairies do in the fairy tale? The fairies utter all sorts of words, in which certain meanings are encoded, addressed to the born princess. Well, the old woman Karabas appears, who undertakes approximately here an action directed approximately here. And what does the fairy of spring do? She takes over governance somewhere here and gives the process a directional flow there. What does the old lady Karabas do? She is forced to come to terms with the situation. Why? Because she has already invested all her energy resources. And it turns out that this picture makes it possible to understand why very often there is a struggle for whose word will be last. Because in general this also refers to the problematics of governance towards matrix egregorial processes. Well, if, after all, the purpose of articulate speech is to govern the flow of matrix egregorial processes, then the non-determinateness of the meaning of words, what is this? In principle, this is a short circuit of the whole system, and as a result of such a short circuit, no one knows where you will find yourself. In addition, and why is the announcement of the prognosis a governorial act? Because when the announcement of the prognosis happens, or the announcement of intentions, and the process has a low measure of stability, then it finds itself under the disturbing impact of those who have become reliably aware of its course. Moreover, among those who have become aware, there may be opponents of this process. Well, or there may simply be idly curious people who just fiddle and see what will happen. This for them is an act of self-gratification. In general, this picture also allows you to answer the question, why not everything that you are going to do should be announced publicly before the process is completed? Dissemination of information about the course of the process for those who are not involved in governance and cannot introduce into the process of governance something of theirs that is positive, it turns out to be harmful in relation to the flow of processes of governance. Well, that is, in general, all that can be briefly told about what the method of dynamic programming is, how it's related to the sufficiently general theory of governance, and how, through the sufficiently general theory of governance, it is connected with life as processes flowing in the triunity of matter, information, measure.
как процессами, протекающими в триединстве материи, информации и мира.
You see, there is one more side of the question related to our purely psychic characteristics. In order to understand something, one must have images. And pictures, in the majority of cases, are informationally more voluminous and give a better idea of the processes, about the flow of processes, the deviation of processes from ideal and acceptable governance, than all kinds of words. And such a scheme, in general, is an extremely voluminous, in the informational regard, image of the entire sufficiently general theory of governance, its connection with life, its connection with the method of dynamic programming, which is a kind of test for the consistency of setting of governorial tasks. That's basically all.